Hello, everyone. I was going to change into like a sports coat and pretend to be professional, then I remembered that my t-shirt is Pikachu drinking coffee, so you get my hoodie. Today we're going to talk about opioid use disorder and the philosophical concepts of desert and justice. Obviously, we know justice. Dessert, I can't recall if we've talked about it or not, but it's unfortunately not fun snacks. It is what we deserve. So we kind of began this conversation, I think, when we were discussing autonomy. We read a response to an A-Job article that I'm now going to have you actually read. Dr. Toei actually published a response to this as well, which I think I'll put on our Canvas. So my plan for today is to give you the philosophical background, and then on Monday we can talk about some of the science and the other articles that we read. I'm going to share my note page with you, and we'll get into it. Okay, so we're going to start with an argument that I'm going to call probability. So this is essentially beginning with a definition of reasonableness. A reasonable person understands that if y is a probable effect of x, then doing x has a probable outcome of y. In other words, we simply understand cause and effect. If I go outside while it's raining, I'm going to get wet, and therefore when I go outside and it's raining, I should not be surprised if I get wet. And if I did go outside while it was raining, and I came back inside and I was like, I don't understand how I got wet, you would know that I'm being unreasonable, right? Okay, so this is a pretty straightforward, just sort of definition of reasonableness that we're going to use here. In fact, I'll just add that. Okay, and then let's imagine that y is disvaluable. So let's say that we understand that y is either socially disvaluable, as in, let's say, driving while intoxicated is likely to lead to an outcome of me getting in an accident with somebody. That is socially disvaluable as well as physiologically disvaluable. Something that might be physiologically disvaluable but not socially disvaluable is if I do nothing but drink Dutch Brothers coffees every single day, I will likely have some problems with insulin. So that's not necessarily socially disvaluable, but it's physiologically disvaluable for me. And we could just continue to think about other kinds of ways that something might be disvaluable. This is just sort of defining, let's imagine. So if it is the case that a reasonable person understands that if x leads to y, then when we do x will lead to y. And we know that y is disvaluable, then a reasonable person wouldn't want to do disvaluable things. And therefore they would not do x because they wouldn't want to arrive at that disvaluable trait. So let's say we'll call this like a normative claim about reason, which is like fairly descriptive. A reasonable person just like probably shouldn't want to do things that aren't valuable. And then we come up with this final normative claim, which is that like a reasonable person shouldn't want to do X. So obviously, we're working about or thinking about opioids here. So if a reasonable person understands that overdose is a probable effect of opioid addiction, then becoming addicted to opioids has a probable outcome of overdose. Overdose has catastrophic physiological and possibly even social effects, and so a reasonable person wouldn't want to have a substance use disorder and do opioids. Great. This is not meant to be earth-shattering. This is sort of like the most likely, I think, way that we would rationalize what we'll call the common way of thinking about substance use disorder. I think based on our conversation that most people in this class don't hold this position, but I would say that we do sort of implicitly hold this position if we think that choices are rational. So what we're going to do today is talk about what we would deserve if our choices are rational, and then ultimately we're going to challenge the idea that our choices are rational, which should come as no surprise. It's kind of what we've been doing. Okay, so first let's distinguish between desert and entitlement. Ignore in your brain whatever you think about for the words desert and the word entitlement. These are not meant to have any kind of valence for those. So desert is something that we deserve by virtue of us having possession of some feature. So this is something about me that can be like I possess the feature of having written a good article. So it could be about something external to me, or it could be I possess the feature of being a kind person. Those are both sort of like things about me. They are virtues of having possession of some sort of feature. Contrast that with an entitlement, which is something that we're entitled to on some basis, for example, an agreement. So the difference here is that a desert is something about a feature, me having possession of that feature, and an entitlement is something about some sort of like on a basis of an agreement or an institution. So do I, let's see, deserve Hulu? Do I deserve to watch things on Hulu? I don't have possession of a particular feature that we would say leads with any kind of salience to me being allowed to watch things on Hulu. But I am entitled on the basis of I pay them, and the agreement is if I give them money, they let me watch their shows. So I'm entitled to watching Hulu. Don't tell anyone I don't pay them. I use my in-laws. Um, so do I deserve housing? Well, this is like a complicated question in the United States, right? Is there some feature that I have that by virtue of having that feature, I deserve housing? Well, we might argue humanity. That's not a compelling reason in the United States. We think of housing as an entitlement, right? I pay my landlord an exorbitant amount of money every month, and basically he kicks that up to the weird corporate group that owns the apartment complex I live in, and they don't kick me out, right? So I'm entitled to live here, but I don't necessarily deserve to live here. And in fact, we might say, like, do I deserve to live here? Well, by virtue of me having 11 years of higher education and being a professor for 10 years, maybe I deserve a better place than my apartment. Not that I'm salty. I'm moving anyway, it doesn't matter. So I hope this sort of gets us to understand the difference between desert and entitlement. And then obviously, again, the real question here is, do we deserve healthcare? Are we entitled to healthcare? We'll pick that up when we talk a little bit more about our right to healthcare. I think that's going to be week 14 or 15. But most relevantly, if somebody chooses to do X, an unreasonable thing, like have a substance use disorder, do they deserve whatever the outcome is? Are they entitled to a particular outcome? And so desert and entitlement can be bad, right? We could deserve something bad to happen to us or be entitled to some sort of social punishment. So this is kind of a question that I want us to think about. And then spoilers, just so you don't get lost here, like I'm going to break this whole thing as usual. So if you feel like this doesn't work so far, that's because it doesn't work, and I've set it up that way. I'm baiting you into it, but also there are people who would defend this position. So that position that I'm talking about would be something like a reasonable person understands that Y is disvaluable. I'm sorry, let me replace the variables. A reasonable person understands that all of the health risks that come along with substance use disorder are probable effects of having a substance use disorder, of using a substance. We all know that those effects are disvaluable, whether it's ending up in the hospital or being unhoused or committing crimes while under the influence. Sorry, I just accidentally bumped my kitty. Um, so a reasonable person wouldn't want to therefore do opioids, and would, by virtue of their reasonableness, deserve whatever happens to them. They would also be entitled to whatever happens to them, which might include jail time or other kinds of punishments, right? And if the secondary question is, what kind of healthcare treatment do they deserve or are they entitled to? We might say, well, the institution or something we'll get to in a moment says that they're not entitled to. Sorry, mix that up. An institution says we're not entitled to some kind of healthcare on the basis of we have done some disvaluable thing to society. Or we might say, even if an institution does, EMTALA, for example, says you have to keep them alive, that they don't deserve it. This kind of logic, like saying it out loud that callously, I hope is a little horrifying to you. But this kind of logic underpins a lot of ethics consults where physicians or the nurses or other parts of the care team sort of feel that a patient may or may not deserve the kinds of treatments that they're getting or the kinds of outcomes that they're getting. This is exacerbated by the fact that we have like limited healthcare, right? Which is to say we don't have infinite beds in the hospital or infinite physicians or infinite time. And so there's sometimes a question of like, does this person deserve a repeated treatment or deserve our attention when there are other people who are potentially more deserving? The question we should then ask is like deserving on the basis of what? So this is justification. There's several different ways of looking at this to sort of like label the donut box before I break it. Like none of these are particularly functional. And this is the paradox that we're going to get into. So one way of thinking about like what do we deserve is virtue of like service to society. This is often attributed to Sedgwick, although it's not entirely clear if he's advocating that or just describing it, which is something that happens with Sedgwick, but he is a utilitarian. So we might say when you do something that is of service to society, you therefore deserve something of comparable weight to the service that you've done to society. This is different than entitlement, of course. So we might be saying like, if you are somebody who works at a use disorder clinic, which is doing good to people who are in need, you are therefore deserving of social praise, you are deserving of moral esteem, and then maybe you're also deserving of like a good lifestyle for having helped people. Or conversely, yes, I don't know if you can hear her yelling, but so she doesn't want to actually be held. She just wants my attention. Um, too bad. You do a meow, you get held. Okay, you go away. Yeah. Conversely, we would say like someone with a substance disorder does a disservice to society. And so by virtue of their disservice to society or their lack of service to society, right? Maybe we say sometimes it's value neutral if their use disorder just sort of leaves them catatonic, or sometimes it's value negative if their use disorder causes them to, I'm using these terms while hating all of them, so just roll with me, like disturb the peace or be visible. I mean, like this is like a whole other kind of way of thinking about it, right? How dare they be visible and muddy up our pretty cities or something like that. But let's say we've decided like that is socially disvaluable, and so they therefore deserve not to be in society, or they deserve to be put away from society in prison, or they deserve whatever sort of health outcomes happen to them. Okay, so there's like, this is compelling if you're a utilitarian or a consequentialist who says that like the moral value of something is measurable by the kind of pleasure or pain that you bring to society writ large. If that's not how you think about justification, well, then that's not particularly useful. So this is the problem with pluralism that we've seen the whole time, which is like maybe pleasure and pain is a good way of measuring it, but then if we're, excuse me, if we're talking about like what's useful to society, there might be different opinions on that, and it's pretty hard to justify those opinions. Or if you do justify those opinions, you're going to have to like go to another justification route. So what we're going to see, like with that one, is that all of these are kind of like stacked on top of each other. So maybe we say, okay, service to society is kind of like a made up idea. There's no like real connection between our social constructions of what's valuable and like the true sort of ontological moral value of these things. So we say, okay, let's just back off a step and say it doesn't need to be ontological, especially since we might not agree on the basis of that. You might think it's because of God, and I might think it's because of like the Christian God. I might think it's because of Allah, and someone else might think it's because of just evolutionary biology, right? Okay, so we say, all right, let's back up a step in a kind of Beecher and Childress procedural way, and think about, oh my goodness, think about institutions as granting the kind of deservedness that we have. So this sounds like maybe conflating desert and entitlement, but this is a philosophy that would believe a little bit more in the sort of like moral goodness of institutions. Not saying all institutions are good, but if there were an ideal institution, it would represent something like the collective wisdom of people, and maybe epiphenomenally that is like more than the sum of its parts. It would have some sort of like moral value on that front. Um, based on our conversations, I doubt anyone in this class is like, yeah, institutions are the way. But I would like point out to us gently that if we're actually leftists, we do think to some degree that like institutions are the way. Otherwise, we're libertarians, right? So, or anarchists, which is fine if you are. But if you identify as a sort of like socialist leftist, you think in some ways some ideal institutions would be the right way to help people. Um, and Scanlon points out that like just because someone's entitled to a certain form of treatment by the rules of some institution doesn't itself show that they deserve that treatment. So he's pointing out that these are to some degree conflated. So once Scanlon points this out, Scanlon's an axiologist. He thinks about like where value comes from. Um, Scanlon's associated with this idea of fitting attitudes, which Miller sort of expands on, and Feinberg is like a very early version of this. They're sort of grandfather of the fitting attitudes approach. And this would say something like, someone's desert is justified if it would be fitting to have a pro or con attitude toward the feature that they have. Let me write that down for you as though you could just remember that. So someone's desert is justified based on whether it would be fitting to have a pro or con attitude toward the feature they possess. So we might say it is fitting to have a pro attitude toward empathy. And so if someone is empathetic, then they deserve goodness. They deserve good outcomes. It is fitting to have a con attitude toward rudeness. So if someone is rude, they deserve whatever the outcomes of that rudeness might be when they're negative. This is like we stand at the precipice of the axiological rabbit hole down which I will not go. God, what comes out of my brain sometimes is strange. Anyway, there are ways to make this more reasonable. I happen to like fit into this school of thought, but like it is a weird and alien and like dark forest that you must journey through to get to like where this makes sense. And frankly, it's not worth it for any of you to do that. Instead, I think what's worth recognizing it is that this is much like Beecham and Childress's kind of coherentism. I'm doing this because I think of it as like, you know, the mobile that we talked about, or like you can put four popsicle sticks together and they hold even though there isn't a foundation. So this says like instead of finding a foundation because we can't all agree on one, what if it just sort of like held together, right? What if it was just sort of like good to generally be positive about this thing? And by good, we mean largely socially agreed upon, largely just sort of feels right intuitionally. And also, most importantly, that it just kind of like hangs together. If we have a pro attitude toward empathy, we should also have a pro attitude toward kindness, which would also imply a con attitude toward rudeness or self-centeredness. Okay, but there's actually just kind of infinite recursion there, right? Why would it be good to have a good attitude toward being good? I'm saying it that way on purpose because it should start to sound a little meaningless to you. So here's sort of where we start to see the problem. So Kagan, who I just found out has the pronoun he, their name is Shelley Kagan. I have imagined them differently than they are, in fact. But Shelley Kagan argues for non-comparative and comparative deserts. So let me explain this to you. It's just a quote from them. They make sort of two claims. One, there's a drawing that goes along with this, and I'm not going to do it for you. We can in class if you're really interested. But basically, it's best from the perspective of non-comparative desert, which is to say, we're not comparing what I get and what you get. We're just saying, like in a sort of principle isolation, it's best when I get exactly the kind of welfare that I deserve. That is a world where he uses he. A world in which he gets exactly what he deserves is better than a world in which he gets more or less, other things being equal. So let's say I'm like a generally kind person, but not, you know, the kindest person. I'm like a generally smart person, but I'm not the smartest person. I deserve to have like a normal life, right? And it would be a less ideal world if, though I'm a generally kind, generally smart sort of person, I have like a really low level of welfare. It would also be unideal if I were wildly famous, very wealthy, and had some weird non-cabinet position that allowed me to utterly undermine our democracy, hypothetically. um, and so the ideal world is one where everyone gets exactly the amount of welfare that they deserve. That seems like, I think, relatively straightforward. And then they say, okay, so let's imagine that this is our midline between like good person, bad person. If someone has a positive desert level, then it's better from the perspective of non-comparison desert if I get more than less. In other words, like by virtue of being on this side of the line, I deserve to, in a margin of error, go that way than to go that way. And conversely, if I'm a shit person, then it's better for me to get less than to get more. This is like kind of mathematically based. The book is called The Geometry of Desert, I believe. So it's kind of mathematical, it's kind of statistical, it makes complete rational sense. We should aim for everyone to get the kind of welfare that they deserve, and then we should, account for margins of error according to where they fall on that good bad scale, depending on how we justify it, and maybe we justify it just by that kind of hanging together fitting attitudes. So we would arrive at something like, if a reasonable person knows that y follows from x and y is bad, and someone does y, then like they deserve a lower degree of welfare. And if we have to fudge with the margin of error, we should aim lower rather than higher. All of which is to say, if someone has an opioid substance use disorder, they are electing to go that way in terms of their welfare. Okay, that's the end of the video. No. So now I'm going to deconstruct that. That's because, or like I'm deconstructing it because it depends on this argument I'm going to call choice. So let's assume that probability is true. You know what? Let me move this up so that we can see probability while I'm talking about this. These are just my, yeah, go for it, AI. These are my arguments. So it's not like you could say, oh yeah, based on the argument choice. This is just me. So let's assume that everything we argued in probability is true. A person who does X would therefore choose for Y to happen. And therefore deserve the associated outcomes. That's essentially what we just argued using Kagan and Skin. But the paradox is like let's assume that probability is true. So a person who does Y, by virtue of probability 4, is not reasonable because we said only a reasonable person wouldn't do X. So I'm sorry, I messed up my variables. Person who does X is not reasonable. This person did X, so they can't be reasonable. So then let's say by definition, capacity is a state of being able to act in accordance with reason. This is like not controversial. We can sort of just blow through this. So therefore, via that definition, people who are acting unreasonably, that is to say doing X, cannot be said to have capacity. And so if they don't have capacity via probability and everything else we just said, someone who does X can't be held to account for choosing Y. I guess I skipped a step, which would be something like people who do not have capacity cannot be held accountable for their actions by virtue of our definition of capacity, right? They can't be expected to act reasonably. They don't have capacity. Yeah, I think that makes it better. Totally open to you arguing against me, by the way. But I think that makes sense in terms of validity. You thought you were done with geometric proofs when you left high school or college. Do people do that in college? People who do science things? I doubt it. You guys do calculus and shit. Okay, so what we've proven with paradox is that either somebody who does X when Y is the outcome that is disvaluable, either they deserve that according to choice, but that would assume that they're choosing it, but they can't be choosing it because we've established that if they did choose it, they'd be unreasonable, and unreasonable people don't have capacity and therefore can't be held to account. So what do we do? I mean, one conclusion is to simply reject the definition of capacity. But that's gonna, I think, run you into a whole bunch of problems where you no longer can define who can make choices. I think that the way around this is to reframe desert in terms of care instead of justice. But that's a problem if we're really invested in social justice. And this is like, once again, the secondary paradox I want us to look at is that we use the language social justice, and so we're evoking the ideas of justice, and that is good and valuable. But also justice as it's been conceptualized, at least in the last, I don't know, 400 years, is like really tied up with rationality and really tied up with autonomy. And it turns out that like it might actually be just not to treat an opioid patient. It might actually be just to blame them for their health outcomes. It might be just to not treat them as punishment for the disvaluable social things that they've done. Clearly, though, it's not caring. And so maybe we need what Virginia held. I remembered her name this time. Nope, it was Annette Beyer, whose name I forgot. Believe it is Virginia held, though, calls caring justice and just care. Once again, we sort of arrived at that place. But I think we need to sort of talk through this on Monday. What I'd like you to pay particular attention to, if you have the time to read it, I'm going to upload 2 articles by people whose names I cannot remember. One of them is ANW, or their last names. Is the other one Kagan? I don't think so. Anyway, 2 articles that look at the science of choice and opioid use disorder in particular, or I think just substance use disorder. There's some interesting sort of like hard descriptive data points that we can bring in here, and then a conversation about sort of like what does that imply for morality. So yeah, we'll do those readings for Monday, and we will hopefully have lots to talk about. I feel like there was something else I was going to say, but this video is probably already quite long. So see you on Monday.